everyone. My name is Samir Ibrahim, and I'm thrilled to facilitate this conversation. We have such a powerful panel today. I think this is going to be really special. For those of you like me who nerd out on food systems and agriculture, this is going to be a treat. For those of you who are dabbling or who don't know about global food systems, or your only interaction with food is eating it, we're going to make this so exciting that even you might find this as special as I do. Panels can sometimes be boring. They sometimes turn into steady streams of monologues where people talk for a very long time, but that's not going to happen today. We all have an intention to run this session as if we're all at dinner, and you, the listeners, are flies on the wall to an incredibly honest and informative conversation. I told all of the speakers before that I would have sent them wine to make it feel more at dinner, but it's morning for most people today, and I didn't want to get in trouble. Our objective today is to walk away with practical next steps. Sure, we're all speaking out our opinions, but the goal is to discuss the how and the why. How can we do something better, and why is it important for you and me? This discussion will be around three major themes: agriculture as an economic engine, sustainable agriculture as a solution to global challenges, and then partnerships. So thank you to our sponsors, Bayer, and session partners, IFC. And let's get started. I'm going to start with Valerie, the Assistant Executive Director of the World Food Program. Valerie, you've said that you tell everyone that you have the best job in the world, feeding hungry people and reaching those further behind. You've seen many different sides of development from USA to the World Food Program. Can you help us set the scene with the current situation of global hunger and chat a bit about how sustainable agriculture and healthy food systems can be an engine for economic prosperity?
Well, thanks so much, Samir. And I do have the best job in the world, but it's a job that's getting a lot bigger because we're working at the World Food Program to put hunger out of business. But meanwhile, because of conflicts, because of climate, because now of COVID, we're seeing hunger on the rise for the first time in decades. And, you know, we look at 811 million people who go to bed hungry every night, 270 million people literally on the verge of starvation. And this puts us in a situation where more than 1 in every 10 people are desperately hungry. And this is really not acceptable in a world where there is enough food for everybody. So hunger is moving in the right direction. We've all signed up to sustainable development goals to end hunger by 2030, but it's bigger than ever. And this growing risk of famine, growing risk of hunger and food insecurity underscores how very important and urgent it is that we use sustainable agriculture and food systems to deliver to all. Now, what we're finding is that unsustainable agricultural practices eat away at people's livelihoods, and they also contribute to climate change, to the loss of biodiversity, and to land depletion. But sustainable agriculture can help address more than one challenge. While agriculture right now is contributing to climate change and is part of the global climate crisis, it can also be part of the solution. And that's what we need to be ensuring, making sure that agriculture is part of the solution to climate change, and it's part of protecting the biodiversity that is so critical for people and for our planet. Nature-based solutions can help address almost 1/3 of all emissions. They can help transform food systems and build adaptation and resilience. Right now, we have a situation where people who are the least responsible for our global climate crisis are the ones who are at the sharp end of the stick in dealing with its repercussions, and the threat of famine in countries like Madagascar, the situation in the Sahel, highlight how very urgent it is for us to do this. So by combating deforestation and reversing it, we can mitigate climate change, we can reduce the risk of future pandemics, we can support lives and livelihoods of the most vulnerable, including smallholder farmers, and really ensure that no one is left behind. That's what we're working towards as the World Food Program, and it's something that requires all sectors of society, international organizations, governments, and the private sector to be working closely together.
Thank you, Valerie. And Lino, what Valerie's talking about is agriculture being at the center of a lot of other large conversations. Climate, she mentioned, economic instability. You often are quite outspoken about what you called, and you have a hashtag for this, hashtag smallholder effect. Can you chat about the smallholder effect and explain that in the context of what Valerie was talking about?
Sure, I can. And first of all, thanks for being here. It's my pleasure. Agriculture is basically at the essence or contributing to a lot of the sustainable development goals from the UN. And if you can think about as an holistic food production, it may give a lot of answers to a lot of the challenges we have today in rural development areas. It is important to acknowledge that farmers, they are really at the center of the entire food production, and to have resilient food systems, you have to have resilient farmers. So the moment you have farmers thriving in doing farming and getting a business out of farming, then you have, all of a sudden, you have profitability in the rural areas. And this will be an effect, like a ripple effect, if you will, that will have all of a sudden a dynamics of the local economics possible. You'll have money available to generate also other kinds of income. You will have local economies being all of a sudden dynamic and possible to be activated. And all of that because you had a food system that worked, and you are not only feeding at the end of the food chain, somebody is being fed, but you are also generating income in rural areas, and with that creating a dynamic that we call it the smallholder effect, so basically a ripple effect activating the economy.
Yeah, I often find it interesting that many people I speak to don't understand that improving and protecting the productivity of these small farmers, the ones that Valerie said are at the sharp end of climate change, actually has macro effects. You have more political stability, food systems are strengthened, et cetera, et cetera. Since you're talking about small farmers, let's hear from the farmer in the group. Rodney, you grew up on a small farm in rural Alabama. And I think you know that sometimes the economic incentives just don't exist for farmers to think about long-term prosperity, like some regenerative agriculture practices. Can you share what you've learned from the Payment for Forest Environment Scheme about how to use financial incentives to help smallholder farmers promote these sustainable agriculture practices?
Well, thank you, Samir. I appreciate it very much. And it's great to be here with you today, live from Concordia. You know, my experience and the experience of my colleagues at Winrock is that smallholder farmers very often know what the value of their own practices are, but they don't know how to access finance or to be compensated for engaging in those better practices. Smallholder farmers know full well that the quality of the soil, the quality and availability of water, access to local markets, they know these things are important, but oftentimes they struggle with how they pay for it. And so the first thing you do is, we try to do at Winrock, is listen to the smallholder farmer. What do they want? What do they say they need? Garner their own enthusiasm, to harness that to help them improve their own livelihood. So you mentioned our payment scheme in Vietnam, for example. We were brought in to Vietnam almost a decade ago to help smallholder farmers and other small business people in the northern part of Vietnam who were struggling with deforestation and forest degradation and terrible conservation practices. And we helped create a scheme by which they were paid to practice better conservation, better farming techniques, better water preservation and water quality techniques. And they embraced this scheme and they were paid directly for it. And it's an example of where when they could tie activity to economic compensation, they were enthusiastic participants. So the whole watershed of the Red River in northern Vietnam was preserved. There were economic activity, an incentive to preserve and conserve, and as a result, hundreds of millions of dollars of economic activity was transferred to these smallholder farmers and other small business persons and artisans in the watershed area. And it's been a resounding success. The government of Vietnam has recognized this as a potential model for the entire country. We've had tremendous private sector support. So that's one small example of listen to the farmer, listen to the smallholders, listen to the small business people, and you'd be amazed at how easily they recognize the value of things that they know they can do if they just have access to the finance to do it.
And also listen to the women, because whenever we talk about farming, we have to talk about women.
And the youth.
And the youth, exactly.
Right.
And Tania, a few days ago, you posted on LinkedIn that the business case to better integrate women smallholders along agriculture value chains has long been made. And I know you have a webinar with the World Food Program, Cargill, and Netafim on this topic on Wednesday. So without spoiling that, can you help us make the connection between women as primary laborers in agriculture and what economic empowerment means on the journey to gender parity?
Sure, thanks, Samir, and great to be here. Look, women form a huge portion of the agricultural labor force, but when you look at the data on their relative productivity, and across multiple studies, including by the World Bank, FAO, et cetera, you see that on average, the productivity of female farmers is lower. And it's lower for many of the reasons that might be kind of obvious, right? So whenever there's a training, who goes, right? It's usually the man. Whenever the training happens at a given hour, it's maybe more convenient for a man to go, et cetera. And so just by circumstance, right, women are frequently left out in terms of access to information. We all know about challenges of access to credit, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that, but also access to inputs, access to markets, right? If you are not necessarily managing the household budget as a woman, it's also difficult for you to make purchasing decisions. And so for us, what we are trying to do is make sure that when our clients who are private sector companies look at these topics, they actually see that there's a very big economic benefit, including to them, of focusing on women when they're looking at their supply chain development. And I can give you a very good example. For example, we're looking at cocoa or coffee, right? And if you look at the types of jobs that men play versus women play, they're sometimes different. Obviously, it varies by country due to the cultural circumstances, but in many cases, the roles that women play are core to the product quality ultimately, right? So if you focus more on training the women, you actually increase product quality, which goes directly to the bottom line, of course, of the household, right? Because they can sell at a better price, but also to the bottom line of the company who is actually able to increase supply, right, from good quality products. And this is what I mean by the business case, right? We see it in terms of both productivity improvements as well as incomes. The question is, how do you actually do this consistently and systematically? And it's hard, right? Because every country has very different cultural impact. And maybe I can give you one example. Actually, it's from a project we just evaluated with our colleagues Netafim in the Sahel region. Valerie also mentioned it. But for example, in the circumstances there, once you start introducing irrigation, women start expanding what they can grow, right? And so instead of just growing the cash crops, they also start growing food crops. And once they grow food crops, they also then have a major impact on the nutrition of the household, right? So it goes a long way. And that's what I mean. It's a good thing. It's not easy to do. And hopefully by learning from what companies have tried, we can all collectively do better.
You mentioned the word access. Even Rodney before mentioned the word access. I have a very interesting quote from Lino from a few years ago. You said that whenever you're asked about what are the most critical issues of smallholders or what is preventing companies from doing business in the smallholder segment, you said you find yourself using and abusing the word access. What do you mean by that? And why do you find yourself using and abusing the word access? I mean, we've heard it many times so far, but yeah, interesting that you did mention this a few years ago.
It's funny that you remind that, because I actually sometimes repeat that way of thinking, because it's from both ways, right? If you look at it from the perspective of smallholders, it's all about access. So it's access to high quality inputs, to know-how, to financial solutions, to markets, right? And that's basically from their perspective. If you look from the other players in the value chain and the partners, it's also access to them, because they are so dispersed and so difficult to access that models that can really success, they need to be close to smallholders, need to be providing solutions last mile. Because I mean, it's from a country level, you may have policies that are there for all the farmers, right? You may have even good infrastructure in some places, but at the end, if you do not bring everything that is required, so the ecosystem of solutions around the farmer, right? He or she will not be able to succeed without having all that at their disposal. So that's the access that I meant back then, and it's completely true today.
I think that might be one of the key takeaways for this section. It's talking about access, and you know, now that we've sort of spoken about agriculture as a tool for prosperity, I'd like to shift us into talking about agriculture technology as a solution to global challenges. So we sort of talked about agriculture and why and smallholder farmers. Now let's shift gears and start talking about how. John, you're at Netafim. Netafim is the largest micro irrigation company in the world. They had a blockbuster deal with Mexichem a few years ago, which was exciting for all of us who are big fans of irrigation. In an interview, you said that you were in the room when Netafim decided that its theme this year is smart irrigation, sustainable solutions. When you think about smart irrigation as a sustainable solution facing global challenges, how do you simplify these really big questions and themes down to irrigation being a solution?
Yeah, first, thank you, Samir, for moderating this, and Concordia for putting this together. I really appreciate it. And I love sharing the stage with all of you. And I really appreciate the folks tuning in as well, because obviously you have an interest in sustainable agriculture, smallholder farming, and that's really exciting for all of us to be speaking to you today. Samir, I've been with Netafim now for about 4 months. And so it's been very exciting getting to know folks like you and others in this room about the work that we're doing together in a lot of these areas. That smart irrigation, sustainable solutions was actually my previous job with the Irrigation Association here in the United States, but I think it translates well to what we're doing here at Netafim, as well as Better Life Farming Alliance with everything we're doing with smart irrigation and sustainability. Before I answer your question, I want to kind of just react to some people first. And Valerie, you mentioned that there's not enough food for everyone, and I completely agree. And you look at the challenges, and this is where technology comes into play, because not only is there not enough food for everyone, there's not enough land or resources right now to produce that food the way we're doing it now. And so we need to use our land more wisely. We need to use our natural resources more wisely to increase productivity while doing that in a climate smart way. And so it's easy to look at it from a broad picture, from talking about agriculture, right? And agriculture is not one entity. It's made up of very small or very large businesses globally. And that's how we get our food. That's how we get our clothes. That's how we get energy. Everything that ag produces, produced by different businesses, different entities around the world. And so how do you shift? How do you make a difference without being able to change agriculture as a whole? And that's really where smallholder farming comes in. Rodney and Lino brought up access to capital and access. And I think that's absolutely right. So look at access to capital, access to land, access to technologies, access to education. So I think when we're looking at the role technologies play, Samir, specifically related to irrigation, we need to look at it both from a productivity perspective, how we're using our water and what we're getting out of it, right? And the next is not only water, but how do we look at soil health and the climate smart practices that are associated with irrigation? So applying chemicals, applying nitrogen, fertilizers, pesticides, whatever you need to produce that food. Whether it's organic farming, not organic farming, we're not talking about that, but whatever we're using, how to apply that in a way that not only benefits your yield, but benefits the environment. And then the education associated with that. You know, there's that old adage of teach a person to fish versus giving them a fish, right? Now we can't just give them technologies. We have to teach them how to use the technologies in a very wise and sustainable manner. And that's really where the importance of these partnerships comes into play, and where NetFM really sees value in everything we're doing with these efforts.
Thank you. And you mentioned something that I'm going to come back to later, unplanned, but you talked about using land and resources more effectively. And that actually sparked a question that I think we will throw in at the end. So thank you for bringing that up. Leesa, John was just talking about very sort of agriculture not being one thing. And we need to not just look at one intervention, but many interventions. Your work with AgriFin, you see a lot of innovation and a lot of interventions. What have you learned about the types of innovations that you think can scale to solve global challenges? You know, if you had a few $100 million, how would you allocate that in terms of agriculture innovations?
Fun question, Samir. Thank you for that. I would dream of having a couple of $100 million to throw at this, but thanks for including us in this panel. I'm as Samir said, I lead the Mercy Corps AgriFin programs based out of our hub office here in Kenya. And we're funded by the Gates Foundation, MasterCard Foundation, Bayer Foundation, to work side by side with private and public sector organizations that are working to design, test, and scale digital services for smallholder farmers. And our goal is to increase income and productivity resilience by 50% and to reach at least 40% women. So we've worked with more than 150 organizations across Africa, including some who are here on this stage. And this question, this has been our driving question, the one that Samir just asked us: what innovation scales, what innovation has impact? I think that we're sitting at a nice place after 6 years of running AgriFin, where we've now seen that the products and services that we're developing on digital channels for farmers are now reaching 98% active use after 3 years. So, you know, we're starting to see what is it that brings farmers to their phone, to their tech, and gets them to use it. And also, another thing that's exciting for us there is that 43% of the active users in our world of 6.5 million farmers are women. So I think we're really encouraged that this can work. But what we definitely have seen, it speaks to the ecosystem points that other speakers have already raised, is that bundling services makes a difference. What's beautiful about digital innovation and technology is that you can incorporate lots of different services. We have finished 17 impact studies this past year. It is very clear that there is accelerated impact for farmers who receive a bundle of services. So that bundle of services tends to include financial services, of course. You know, to Tania's point earlier, the digital world enables financial services, whether that's crop insurance or savings or loans. But financial services by themselves, actually, what we found, don't drive a lot of interest from farmers. They have to have a production use case with the financial services to truly pick it up and run with it. One of the most important is access to markets. But I would say from our impact studies, we've seen 75% increase in productivity for farmers who have access to a digital marketplace. Digital markets are usually better organized, more transparent. They're certainly easier for women who can't always get to market, can always bring their products and services to market. But what we also have seen is that access to irrigation, John and Samir, access to mechanization are super important. I mean, this is where we're seeing 75, 85% increase in productivity for farmers. But what farmers always want to do is learn. It is the number one thing they want to pick up in a bundle. They want to be better farmers. This is an area where I think digital services can really help make a difference in climate smart agriculture, helping to drive behavior change. So yeah, I think what we're seeing also is that technology by itself, particularly for women, really does still require human touch. And there's a creative piece of meeting farmers where they are, walking that pathway between technology and all of the benefits you can get from technology. And just want to applaud the World Food Program. Since the session was open with WFP, we've worked with the Farm to Market Alliance with WFP for a long time, and they have brought more women who were subsistence farmers in the middle of nowhere, Tanzania or Zambia, into the real marketplace. They've helped them reduce time poverty. They've helped them increase income, feed their families. So pulling all of this together, I think is the most important thing. We've got to keep going with bundles, make them digital, data driven, and smart and inclusive.
I may prod at the few $100 million question later, but we'll see how I'm feeling towards the end of the conversation. Sam, in a Rotary Club video from a couple of weeks ago, you mentioned that we need to work with communities to understand their needs, not top down. And this kind of talks to the bundled question that folks have been mentioning so far. You mentioned that lots of organizations are building wells throughout Africa, but they aren't doing it in the right way. And I agree with you 100% here. Do you have any examples of how trying to scale agriculture technology or other interventions has failed because folks weren't partnering with communities?
Yeah, great question. Thank you so much, Samir, for moderating this, and such a pleasure to be here with all of my esteemed colleagues today. It's a great group and a great dialogue for sure. And I'm glad. I thought you were going to actually ask me for a few $100 million. So that's a relief knowing
that's in person later today.
Well, there you go. That's right. As one of the philanthropy guys at the table here. No, it's a great question. I think that the concept of failure is far too taboo in the donor space, in the implementation space, and the partnership space. And it goes back to something I think that I really like that you said earlier when we were chatting before the panel kicked off, and that is that oftentimes people are so pressured to make the right decision that they freeze, they pause, and they take so long that they miss the opportunity. No action ends up occurring. The problem isn't addressed because there's that fear that comes from a variety of sources, and we could talk more about that later. But people are afraid of failing. And so what happens is people are encouraged to selectively pick data. They're encouraged to find things that work and then assume that that thing is going to work long term, or assume that because it worked in one location, it's going to work somewhere else. And they aren't necessarily incentivized, motivated to monitor the results long term. And so as we think about the well-being of smallholder farmers who are absolutely critical to solving so many of the world's most pressing problems, we have to think long term. How can we ensure that the impact that we sustain or that we make today can be sustained post-intervention? What does that look like? And that requires a local partnership, a local buy-in. You can't come in as an outsider. Even if you think you know what this community needs, and even if you think you believe what's going to be effective in this community, you can't come in and say, good news, here's what you're going to do, set it up, and then leave. It doesn't work. You have to go into Rodney's point earlier, I loved, you have to listen first. Even if you are so sure in the solution or in the opportunity that you have to listen first. What are the community's needs? What are the community's wants? What are the challenges that they face? What inspires them? What will engender the enthusiasm necessary to facilitate the local buy-in? And as Leesa was saying, how can we make sure that we're looking at behavior change? What is going to facilitate that behavior change long term? So all of these elements are so important from the beginning, and then working alongside the community to design the intervention, to inspire engagement in that intervention, and then to ensure that that intervention can be sustained and maintained long term. And as we think of failures, to your point, the path to where is paved with good intentions, right? And we see that so often in so many different cases. And coming from the water space, I've only been in my role leading AB InBev Foundation for about 3.5 months, so I beat John just a little bit on the new guy label. But previously, I was in the water space. And in the water space, just like in the agriculture space, they go hand in hand. You see the best intentions not being sustained long term. And you see broken down wells, you see broken down irrigation systems, you see things that were designed without an understanding of the real world implications and challenges and constraints that the people are going to be experiencing on the ground. And so you see so many examples, more examples than I can paint in one dialogue. But I think part of the solution is taking the right approach in engaging with the local community and working with them to build something that is truly customized, localized, and sustainable long-term.
I always say that the best R&D facility is on farm, and you have to build things for your customers, but with your customers. I can't tell you how many farms I've been to that have turned into moratoriums of just useless products, and it's sad. It's super sad. Tania, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I wanted to come in because I think all of us have mentioned sustainability. And for us as IFC, this is really key because for us, sustainability is how do you make it a business driver? Because that's the only way that it will work after we leave, right? And making sustainability a business driver means that everybody in this complex ecosystem that people have talked about, right? From credit to off-takers to markets, everybody has to benefit. Everybody has to see the benefit. Otherwise, we'll leave and just like the abandoned irrigation infrastructure, right? Nobody cares about it. They go on business as usual. And so because it's such a complex ecosystem, this is where I find the partnership with Bayer and Better Life Farming, for instance, very exciting because you are trying to bring very different players to the table, right? You're talking about input providers, seeds, chemicals, crop protection. You're talking about infrastructure, irrigation. You're talking about advice and solutions, right? Supporting local agripreneurs who can actually teach their local neighbors around what works and what doesn't. And they were talking about off-takers. So if we really think about what makes sustainable value chains, it's actually a company at the end of the day that's going to be providing the market for the things that are sustainably produced, right? And so it's really hard to get that right, really, really hard. And I think that's where building an ecosystem requires people who maybe traditionally haven't worked with each other before to come together and explore really interesting partnerships, right? With WFP, with financial institutions, a lot of the work that Leesa is doing in digital finance. So unfortunately, it's very difficult, right? There's no magic bullet. So you have to really adapt to the local circumstances, as Sam says, try it, see what works, and then make sure that the partnership is strong enough to continue. So this is what we are seeing, and this is where companies play a huge role, right, in actually demanding the products from the smallholder farmers that are done in that way.
It was almost a perfect transition to the Better Life Farming Alliance, which I'm getting to in just 1 second. So thank you for that. Before I actually, Valerie, Sam is talking about abandoned irrigation infrastructure. That reminds me of something we did we did some work in Somalia. We did some irrigation infrastructure for an NGO. And we came back and it was all ripped up out of the ground because they were getting food stamps in the small town that we did it in. Valerie, from a really big World Food Program perspective, how do you balance thinking about long-term solutions that meet the needs of folks in the field versus being a stopgap for emergencies? And how do you balance that push and pull at a really big level, because you're working all over the world and you have huge teams and huge mandates? How do you think about that?
Well, thanks for the question, Samir. And I mean, just before I answer it, I want to just amplify how very important it is that we look at agriculture as a solution to climate change rather than as a cause, because it is so very much part of the problem at this stage. I mean, when we see that 17% of greenhouse emissions emissions come from direct agricultural activities and an additional up to 14% through land use conversion, then I mean, there's just no question that the main way we need to make sure that agriculture can become part of the solution is by increasing soil health and vegetation cover. So coming to the points that John was raising, and more efficient irrigation management is key to that. The introduction of renewable energy is essential. Reducing livestock methane emissions is key. And then these landscape management approaches that can be part of this, solutions ecosystem with watershed management, rangeland reforestation, et cetera. And then that comes to the issue that you were raising. What we try to do at the World Food Program is, we're very much focused at on those populations that are, as I said before, at the sharp end of the stick, not responsible for the crisis, but suffering the repercussions of it. And when you're dealing with that, when you're dealing with people who are in a kind of house on fire situation, your first focus has to be on putting that fire out. So making sure that we get food assistance, whether that's through providing food or providing cash to buy food if it's available locally, but just not accessible to the population, so that people can meet those immediate needs here and now. But we look at this across a kind of saving lives and changing lives scenario. So how do you engage with those same communities in ways that helps them make the kind of investments that they need to be making to be lifting themselves out of poverty? And so engaging with people around introducing as soon as possible conditionality into the assistance so that communities are engaged in those landscape management approaches, in better watershed management, developing some low-tech irrigation solutions that help them provide water for their crops, for their livestock, manage it in a more equitable way, bring in some of those technical partnerships to help grow the skills base of the farmers. And as others were saying before, really listening to them about what assets and infrastructure they need in order to improve their production, improve their marketability, and then investing in those in a way that they're owning them, they're part of building them, and responsible for managing them into the future. One other way that we do this is by actually, bringing the market to the population. And so we buy, as the World Food Program, more than $3 billion worth of food around the world. We're trying to find ways to ensure that up to 10% of that is actually sourced from smallholder farmers. So as they start to build the surpluses, buying that surplus from them at a fair price that helps improve their marketability and put investments in their technical skills on the back of that. So I think there's a range of ways in which we can help grow the marketability of smallholder farmers while introducing them to more climate smart agricultural practices.
That's amazing. Thank you. And music to my ears as well. So now that we've sort of started by understanding how agriculture interventions can solve big global problems, and now we know some of the types of solutions that we can implement, let's talk about why we're all here, partnerships. And Tania, thank you for the segue into the Better Life Farming Alliance. Lino, what is the Better Life Farming Alliance, and what role do partnerships play in its success?
Well, Better Life Farming Alliance is actually the result of several years of trying to find out an answer how to unlock the farming potential of smallholders. I think we all agree here that smallholders are sometimes used like a problem in some cases, linked also to climate, but they are also the solution that we need to find. They are the basis for the solution. And I think it's important to think about two things here. One is that not all smallholders are the same, right? If you think about this pyramid that Prahlad published in the Future at the bottom of the pyramid in 2009, and think about the subsistence at the bottom and the progressive farmers at the top, most of the solutions we are able to bring, especially as global players, they will basically reach to the more progressive farmers. They will allow them to strive, to do their business, but will be just not serving everybody in the pyramid. So the more we want to go to the bottom of the pyramid, the more we need to involve partners. And then I come to the second point, which is important, which is the fact that farmers, they have many needs, but only value chains that are actually bringing some business model to the players in that value chain will be resilient, as Tania mentioned before. So there needs to be some business for everybody around that value chain. Otherwise, it can only survive if there is a sponsor somewhere in the game. If there is some donor, if there is some program paying for it. Otherwise it will stop. Now, Better Life Farming had this thesis. So if we are able to identify the specific local needs of farmers, and by identifying them, ask the partners who can address those needs and work together for the same farmers, for the same communities, can we make it happen? And the first results were amazing. Back in 2017, we had really doubled yields in Uttar Pradesh with green chili farmers and tripled incomes. And we were all excited about it. Now, the second question came, how can we scale, right? Because if you just Google successful smallholder programs, you will just get lost. Everybody is successful everywhere. And so were we. Now, the second question is, how can we make it bigger? And we came to this model of the last mile access, which we call the Better Life Farming Centers, which are actually little kiosks, little centers owned by either farmers themselves or agri-entrepreneurs, and that they will be like the contact point for all the know-how that the partners can give. And they can reach out to up to, well, more than 500 farmers, in some cases even 1,000 farmers, because they will be seen as a trust point, access point for the inputs, access points for the know-how. The partners do the trainings close to these farmer centers. We have also little farms where we demonstrate the agronomic value of our solutions, because believe me, in many of these geographies, farmers can only trust their fellow farmers. So there is no better source of trust than the one that is generated locally. And with that, we are able to replicate this success and basically put this know-how and these inputs at the access of the communities. And what you can do then, and we may go there in the discussion later, the moment you have this point of truth, point of trust, point of access, then you can go even beyond farming. People start trusting you. People can, even the owners of these centers, they themselves have the freedom. We have people doing yoga trainings they call it, well, if it's better life, let's do yoga trainings, right? If it's better life, let's do female trainings. We have female owners of the centers. And by the way, that's one of our targets, to have as many as possible. We are already above 10% of female owned Better Life Farming centers. And then women trust other women. And then you can see female run Better Life Farming centers with many women going into these centers, which they would not do if that would not be run by a woman. So all this is kind of coming back again to you, Samir, to the first question, to this smallholder effect. So it's really a ripple effect, but needs to start local, needs to start building trust, building the access.
John, what's it like being a partner in the Better Life Farming Alliance, and what role can you play, one, in helping it scale to other markets? So for example, countries in Africa. And two, how do you think about scaling different types of solutions? Netafim works with really big solutions and also really small solutions. And how do you think about that as it relates to these types of partnerships? So two questions. Let me know if you want me to repeat either.
And yeah, so I'll try to answer both. If I don't answer them, bring it back over. So yeah, so I think I'm going to actually take a step back and talk about the partnerships one, because that's what's important. Netafim cannot do this by ourselves. So when we talk about scaling this out to different areas, whether it's in Africa or South America or Asia, wherever we're going, right? We're gonna have to rely on partners, because we can't do this by ourselves. The partners around the room can't do it by themselves. We each have a unique role to play in all of this. So I think that when we're looking at, from Netafim specifically, and our expertise, what we're doing, yes, we have very large customers, very small customers, all very important to our global food supply. And we work hard to provide solutions for each one, meeting their locally driven needs. And I think that's another concept that's out here is really creating solution based on what the locality needs. So, I'm sitting here in North America. What we see in the United States is not necessarily what's needed in Africa or Central and South America or Asia or Europe or wherever else. So our technologies play a unique role for each one of our customers and are tailored to fit their local needs. So when we look at scaling and the role we play, you look at the water infrastructure, the water source, how the water is applied, all of these things, right? And I think, Lino, you brought it up again, is creating that trust where we see it in the United States, where I'm sitting right now. Farmers rely on each other. That's the most trusted source. And really being a part of that partnership as a whole in working with them, creating that trust with them to have locally driven solutions. And from Netafim's perspective, from that water side of the equation, how to manage your water supply effectively, apply it efficiently, and then look at how you're applying those other types of inputs through irrigation. So that's really how we're looking to play a role in scaling this to other areas. And I think you may have had another question that I did not answer, and I apologize.
No, you did, because
Okay,
yeah, you did. I was talking about, the challenge of designing multiple different solutions as a technology provider, large farms, small farms, and you answered that well. Thank you.
good.
Tania, from the IFC, commercial capital, capacity building, what role do you play in this, and how do you think your role might shift to help scale better life farming, right? Because we need to do all this stuff 100,000 times bigger than we're doing right now. What role can the IFC play?
Yeah, easy question. Look, finance is our middle name, right? So we're primarily a financial institution. And our portfolio of investments in agribusiness right now is roughly $5 billion, right? In every part of the agribusiness value chain. So production all the way through to banks who are lending for agriculture, right? And so that's our primary role. But alongside the finance, what we're finding is that to get this ecosystem right, we can also support our clients with advisory services, right? Maybe in areas which are a bit outside of their core expertise. So for example, a lot of our clients who are, buying rice, for example, or buying green peppers, they can supply agronomy to farmers, right? They can help them understand how to improve their yields. That's, not our job as IFC. But what we're also finding is, especially in the smallholder supply chain, a lot of the smallholders actually don't really think of their operation as a business. And I think Leesa was talking about this mindset earlier, but it's fundamental, right? Unless you actually see your smallholder farm as a business rather than as an ATM, like I need cash, I'll go get my cocoa pod harvested. Unless you actually think about it as a business, you don't make necessarily the optimal decisions about what inputs you buy. How do you, interact with the irrigation infrastructure? How do you find better, higher value added clients, right? And so this is where we as IFC have invested in coming up with a curriculum. It's called the Agribusiness Leadership Program, which essentially tries to help different actors, from farmers to aggregators to last mile retailers, actually professionalize their operation so they can change the mindset, right? And make very different decisions. It's something that we've been rolling out with Better Life Farming Alliance in India, successfully focusing on the segment Lino talked about of the agripreneurs, right? The actual last mile retailers. But it's just as applicable when we're talking about smallholder farmers. And in Africa, for us, this has been financial literacy, right? How can you actually benefit from all of the digital financial infrastructure that exists if you don't have some basic financial literacy, basically as a skill set? So this is where our focus has been. And what we really hope is that besides from financing the off-takers for the good work, for the good crops that are being produced, and or financing financial institutions who are financing the farmers in turn, that combining this financial services with our advice, with the other, complementing the other players in the ecosystem is how we can make a difference. But I still think Africa is a whole big different ballgame. We can talk about it later, but I think this is one of the most challenging parts in the world, I think, to make this work for various reasons.
I'll actually ask Rodney to talk about it now. Rodney, your organization has done work all over the world. You've implemented programs in multiple countries and multiple continents. Seen the work you've done at Winrock. If we were to replicate the Better Life Farming Alliance in any country in sub-Saharan Africa, which is very different, so we can pick a country as an example, or you can talk thematically. what would need to look different or be modified in order to really think about replicating this all over the world? And I know everyone's been really good keeping their questions short, so I really answer short. I really appreciate it. For this question, Rodney, feel free to take your time on it. There could be a lot here. No pressure. And you're on mute. Rodney, you're still on mute right now.
Well, thank you, Samir. That's an interesting question because as several of the speakers have alluded to, Africa represents a unique challenge because everything we've talked about, every micro challenge exists in Africa, right? Let me start with an unusual answer. Since this is supposed to be a dinner party, let's introduce some other topics. I think political stability is a real challenge to be able to replicate something like the Better Farming Alliance. It's very difficult to Tania's point to consider yourself a successful business when you don't have confidence in the political or business environment in where you're operating. I think you tend to revert back to a subsistence mindset, and when you see large swaths of Africa, including South Sudan, for example, which is now coming out of the latest round of its civil unrest, you're starting from ground zero with hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of subsistence farmers. And all of the things we've talked about have to be injected into that ecosystem, but you're starting from ground zero, literally. And so political stability is one. The second one I would say also, which is maybe a little hasn't been fully considered, and that's transnational water rights, in that we are looking at a situation in Africa where no watershed adheres to national boundaries, right? And so you've got watersheds in sub-Saharan Africa, the watershed that is shared by Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda. These are going to be enormous issues going forward globally. Winrock's fortunate in that we manage a program for USAID called the Sustainable Water Partnership. And one of the tasks within that is to come up with transnational water right adjudication processes so that we can look at how we're going to manage large-scale water issues across multiple political jurisdictions going forward. So those are the macro issues I think that we can't ignore. If you ignore those, I think you're turning a blind eye to extraordinarily important issues that have to be managed going forward. The other one, and this also may be a little different than what we've been talking about, is we've all alluded to or addressed directly the fact that farming contributes enormously to greenhouse gas emissions. There is no better farming alliance until there are better environmental measurement and mitigation efforts put into place. You could certainly, in the short term, you can improve smallholder success. You can provide access to markets. You can improve mechanization. You can do many things, but in the medium to long term, it's going to be a folly, because we have to now begin to integrate environmental sustainability and improved agricultural practices for smallholder farmers. We have to do it right now. And in order to do that, we're going to have massive partnerships across all the organizations on this call, governments, foundations, private sector. This has to be an imperative, because there is no solution to climate change. There is no 1.5 degrees unless we have a strategy to address agriculture and its contributions and land use generally. As Valerie alluded to, it's not just agriculture, it's also land use, it's also deforestation, which you may not think has anything to do with agriculture. I know everyone on this call understands that, but those two things are completely interdependent, forestation and deforestation, because most deforestation happens to increase agricultural land availability. So we have to begin now to develop technologies, strategies, political will to make the case that there is no difference anymore between successful agriculture and environmental sustainability. And that in and of itself is going to be an enormous challenge, but there's plenty of folks who are doing it or trying to do it. There are new technologies, there are new political efforts to create this type of cooperation. I could go into many of them that we're involved with, but I think most folks here understand the point. So that would be my answer. I'm sorry that this was sort of more of a macro answer than a micro answer, but
no, this is great.
I believe unless we attack both micro and macro solutions, we won't succeed.
I completely agree. And thank you for that. And on the deforestation point, I often find that also when farmers aren't productive, they need to make income somewhere else. So they often go and cut down trees to make charcoal, and the whole sort of cycle starts again.
Absolutely.
Sam, we were talking before about the need to build with communities, and a number of people have spoken about bundles. And I often find that when you try to bundle too much, it gets too complicated. How do you think about building with communities and the need to create bundles at the same time? And how do you think about that sort of build up to a bundle over time?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, right? It's about that balance of doing not too much, but not too little either. And I think, to your point, I think it takes a long-term view of things and a very strategic plan that understands in phases, here are how things are going to be rolled out in phases. And again, these phases are developed with the community, right? With their buy-in based on their needs and their motivations, working with them to develop a multi-year plan that brings a whole host of things to the table. And on the theme of this question, partnerships are so important in that effort. Making sure that you have the right people at the table, the right people on the ground alongside you to bring the strengths that they have, the expertise, the resources that they might have to help make a meaningful difference. And one of the things we're very proud of on the AB InBev corporate side is the local partnership we have with World Food Program in Tanzania and Zambia, looking at just that. How can we have a long-term approach to get the various resources, the various things that the communities and the smallholder farmers themselves need out to those who need them most. And it does take that long-term view and that long-term approach to bring all the different pieces to the table. But getting back to a previous point, I think we have to look at innovation as well and understand there's no harm in trying new things. It's so easy to assume that we already have everything we need and we just have to package it a little bit differently. One of the things we're very proud of at AB InBev Foundation is taking a slightly different approach and figuring out where are those philanthropic white spaces and where is there potential for innovation and how can we help test that? Let's not be afraid of failure because that's equally valuable. And then let's be transparent about those results. So as we think about that bundling question, I think we have to be open to the idea of things will fail. And let's be transparent about that. Let's share those results, not just within the cross-sector partnership that we're developing for those bundles and those communities, but more broadly, globally, so that others are encouraged to replicate our successes and avoid our failures. And I think that will help scale longer term this bundled approach that's so critical for long-term impact.
Leesa, we're talking a lot about bundles. We're talking a lot about hubs and the Better Life Farming Alliance. We're talking a lot about Sub-Saharan Africa. And I think that Sub-Saharan Africa is interesting because if we are going to figure out how to, one, grow enough food to feed the world, and two, figure out how to help those that are most affected by climate change adapt. Sub-Saharan Africa, you have 2/3 of the population that are farmers. They live off-grid. They live in rural areas. You have 60% of the world's unused farmable land. You have abundant groundwater resources. The International Water Management Institute just put out a great report on this. And you have folks like yourself who have tried to build hubs. And actually, a very similar approach to the Better Life Farming Alliance. And you've worked on it and you've seen people work on it in many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. Can you share what's gone right and what's gone wrong when trying these sort of vertically integrated hub-based partnerships in, for example, Kenya?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, just because there's so much interest around the UN Food Summit, Food System Summit, around the idea of these hubs. One thing that I'd love to share with the group is an output that we've been involved in called the Future Marketplace Playbook, that looks at all around the world at how technology is driving transformational food systems. But Sub-Saharan Africa does have its specific issues. I think that where we've seen things succeed, we've had a good role of government, good engagement in government. I mean, I think you can't really divorce agricultural change from government. You can't do it entirely by private sector. So there has to be a good role for the government to engage. I think both Kenya and Ethiopia have shown amazing ability to work with data and work with agriculture and recognize that they need to work with a light touch. And this is something I think in irrigation that's extremely important, is to figure out where strategic subsidies should go. So the role of government, I think, is a critical enabler. It can either go very, very, very good, well in the right direction, or very poorly in the other direction and undermine markets. I think we all know that. But so I think that a balanced relationship between private sector and public sector is extremely important. I also think that the banks have to be engaged, and it's always great to see Tania and IFC on these calls, because we need to be in this pandemic era. The inability to move money across agricultural systems is very problematic, especially for smallholder farmers. Commercial sources of funding have dried up. So I think the collaboration where financial service providers and ag tech, ag business, and government can come together and be enabled by smart subsidy, by organizations like WFP, by World Bank, Gates Foundation, then you begin to see the nexus of transformation. I also think it's very important, those social impact investors who are there, really across Africa, looking at what is transformational, what technology could be a game changer. Samir was one of those early game changers, and you love to see impact investors, coming in and making sense of some culture, letting it reach its potential. Twiga Foods, now reaching 89% of urban retailers with fresh food, direct from the countryside. So yeah, I think that the impact investors need to be there in the mix as well. It has to be a collaborative space. And the government needs to know when to get out of the way and when to get in the way. But I think that Kenya is shining a light and needs a lot more support to play that role. But completely agreed on bundling becoming very, very complex, and possibly slowing things down. I think that I love the idea of approaching things through a product roadmap and really understanding what communities need, what farmers need, and starting with what's simple and scaling it. We reached 16 million farmers with COVID information on digital channels in 6 months, because just straight up information, and then you build around that. So some things are more complex, some things are an easier win, and I think we should focus on the roadmap, because we can't wait too long to get this out there.
Information you've mentioned twice, and we've surveyed our farmers at Sun Culture, and the number one thing people ask for is actually information above markets. And I think that's because Kenya imports $15 billion of food every year, and I think that people just want access to more information as well. You also mentioned subsidies, and I find that very interesting, because in every market around the world, access to energy and access to agriculture products has been subsidized. But when we look at the markets in sub-Saharan Africa, there are very few subsidies and people often shy away from subsidies. Valerie, how does the World Food Program think about subsidies? And how do you think that the conversation may need to shift in order for there to be smart time-bound subsidies to help promote the uptake of some of the agriculture technologies that we're talking about?
Well, I think there's sort of subsidies with the big S, I guess I would say, and then ways in which you can make and help agriculture be profitable. I mean, when it comes to subsidies that are put in place at a macro scale in a country, we often tend to be the ones coming in and helping governments move off of subsidies into a more structured, more balanced social protection system that enables those who require targeted support to receive that support so that they can address their basic needs, food being a key part of that basic need, usually constituting 60% of a poor household's expenditure, but then other, fuel, education, healthcare also being important parts of the housing, being part of the equation. So, really working with governments to help ensure that they have strong social protection systems in place that are inclusive, that are resilient to shocks, and that these are on their books so that they can be also sustainable over time is a way that we would really be addressing these issues rather than promoting broad-based subsidies. At the same time, and here's sort of subsidies with the small s. I mean, we've changed our business model quite considerably as WFP. We now, for the past 2 years in a row, put $2 billion in the hands of people through cash transfers. Now, that's a way of putting cash in the hand of targeted, vulnerable people who then go out to their markets, small markets, and purchase the food that they need and they want to feed their households and their families. And when you can drive those choices to make them more nutritious, to focus more on fresh produce, then you're having an impact on the market, and you're having an impact on what's grown, and you're having an impact on nutrition that is invaluable. So we tend to focus at those levels. And then just coming back to the issue of the cross-sector partnerships, I mean, I think it's just we're also clear that private sector is a vital stakeholder in this process, and not just from the financial perspective, but from also the knowledge, the expertise, the innovation perspective. And we, like others, are finding these spaces and these platforms, whether it's with the Better Life Farming Alliance in South Asia, or the Farm to Market Alliance in East Africa, or the work with AB and Bev that we're doing in Tanzania and Zambia. Like finding that sweet spot where we can combine private, public, international organizations in a space that helps us ensure that small farmers, which are small businesses, become more successful businesses, is just so key to their sustainability and their ability to not just feed themselves and their families, but also their communities and the broader ecosystem.
I could have a whole 4-hour conversation on direct cash transfers. We don't have that time right now, unfortunately, but I love the work that the World Food Program was doing on that. We're going to go through some round robin questions right now. So everyone's going to answer these. And I'm just going to start from my screen, top left. Spoiler alert, John, you're first. And I have a couple of questions for everybody. I'm going to go back to the what would you spend a lot of money on? Let's do $1 billion. And while I agree with Sam that there's a lot of room for innovation, I also have a thesis that we have all of the tools we need today to solve all of our problems today. I think innovation can make it better. I think innovation can make things stronger. But I do think that over the last decade, we've been able to see actual results from some of the things that have been implemented And if we put more money towards that, so larger chunks of capital towards fewer solutions to really move the needle, my thesis, and we can have a debate in person on this, is that we will see a lot of change. So John, $1 billion to allocate any way you'd like in the nexus of sort of agriculture, food systems, and climate. How would you do it?
Is this coming from Sam? Is this $1 billion from you, man, or what?
This is going to you. This is going to you.
Well, no, I mean, the money is coming from Sam to me.
Mike, yeah, money, I think.
That's what I heard.
Sam, yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay.
I heard that too.
You're newer than me, Sam. I can. So that's a great question, and I have to give some thought to this, of course. But I think what you're saying is correct. We have to look at this. If I had $1 billion to spend globally, we really want to seek where we're going to make the most impact with that money. And from the viewpoint of irrigation and water use, you look at those water-stressed areas that have a need for access to food. We are producing food in many cases the same way we did 1,000 years ago. And so when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions or carbon sequestration or whatever that is, we need to move that needle over to be more acceptance of new practices and new ways of doing things, that does not need to be done the same way it has been for hundreds and hundreds of years. So I think if with this money that we have to invest from the irrigation perspective, water stressed areas, access to food, look at those farmers that don't have access to that capital, going back to an earlier discussion, and where we can make the most impact. As far as specific examples go, of course, I have to give some thought to that, but really that's where I'd spend most of my time giving up that money in the front end, Samir.
Cool, thank you. Valerie, would you just give it away?
Yeah, I would invest in school meals for children because that for me is the most sort of perfect way of getting nutritious food directly into the mouths of children, investing in their education and their prosperity in the future, linking that to local production and driving the market around that outlet of the schools for that local production. So sourcing all the food locally, and then the way you contribute to the entire community and their food security. So I would put it into school meals for children, definitely.
Okay, Money Man Sam.
Great question. And sadly, I'm not the sole contributor of the $1 billion in this one, John. So, but no, I think it's such an important and fun kind of thing to think through. And I think there's so many different ways you can go about answering it. I think quickly from my side, I think a couple of things I would look at would be efficiency. How can we improve the efficiency of the work that's already being done, the bundling opportunities that are out there? To your point, Samir, so many new innovations and technologies exist. How can we bundle them most efficiently to meet the needs of the local environments where they work? Understanding one size doesn't fit all, but really driving efficiency. And then secondly, I think resiliency, knowing climate change, knowing the impact it's going to have. How can we really make sure that through the efficient interventions we're implementing, whatever that might look like, how can we make sure we're also being mindful of long-term resiliency so that what we do today can help position the global community for the effects that are going to come. And then hopefully, to John's point, that drives a greater impact at scale long-term.
Lino.
Well, two answers. First of all, very disappointed that people did not mention invest in better life farming, because it would be for me the obvious outcome of the discussion. But no, more seriously, I do think that part of that money I would definitely invest in bringing solutions, so resilient solutions to last mile, and picking up to what was said before, ensuring that they would need to be based on sustainability principles, environmental impact reduction, capturing carbon, reducing usage of natural resources. So this needs to be a must. I completely agree, and that's what we do in better life farming. But the big chunk of that money, I would definitely put it in science. So R&D is the basis of knowledge, and we need to trust science, and we need to all together work on better seeds, better technologies for the farmers. So that would be my 50-50 split of the 1 billion, which is quite a lot of money. We're very generous, Samir. but if it's put on the right place, it can make a lot of change.
And I like asking this question because the money exists, right? It's I think that sometimes we have a resource coordination challenge amongst everyone.
Let me just react to that. I think money is not the problem, honestly. So there is a lot of money available. The point is really on how to make this money to generate resilient solutions. That's mainly the issue. And the topic of governance, how do we work together in the partnerships? How can we make that available money is orchestrated in a way that generates sustainable solutions?
Tania, I know the IFC manages more than this, but $1 billion extra to do whatever you want with it. Don't even need to get a return, which is different. How would you do it?
So maybe my answer is a bit non-traditional, but if you look at different crops, and if you're looking at the concept of a resilient farmer, there is this concept of a minimum efficient scale, right? And so we know that a large number of the smallholders are just never going to meet these criteria, right? They might try to do all the right things, but economically it's just not going to make sense. And the big problem is that the number of smallholder farmers in the world is actually increasing, right? It's not decreasing, it's growing. I think when we were looking at this alliance, Lino, a few years back, the number was around 500 million. Now I think the latest data, it's 550 million, right? So until we solve for that, actually, I'm not sure we're going to be able to make progress, especially on some of the big issues that Rodney mentioned, which I completely agree with. So I think we actually have to get better at creating jobs off the farm, right? Because how many smallholders are there by choice? I don't know, right? But if you see what happened in China, right? I mean, there was a huge job creation potential. Right? People moved from the fields into the factories, and this is how the wealth in the country was generated. And so that's not happening in Africa, right? For instance, not nearly at a scale that we need it to happen. And recently we did an assessment around digital skills in particular, right? So there are many companies in Africa that are kind of skipping the manufacturing stage, right? And looking at the services agenda. And to do that, they actually need workers who have a basic level of digital skills, and they cannot find them locally, right? So you have a precarious situation where they have to actually import workers from abroad to develop a new sector of the economy. And at the same time, the smallholder farmers are getting further and further left behind. So what I would do with this money is actually get governments to introduce basic digital skills across all of the schools or educational institutions in Africa to allow this reskilling and to allow some of these modern sectors to take off. So maybe a non-traditional answer, Samir.
No, that's what we're looking for. Rodney, you win a $1 billion grant to manage. What do you do with it? You're still on mute. No, you're on mute, Rodney.
Sorry. I agree with something you said earlier, but slightly disagree. And if you said that we have, in terms of helping smallholder farmers, we have information on the solutions. We know what to do. I agree. That's the part I agree with for the most part. Where we don't have the solutions are on the resiliency side. In that if you accept my argument, my previous argument that integrating environmental sustainability and agricultural success for smallholders is essential to the future of the planet, we have to have a better set of tools to measure greenhouse gas emissions, sequestration, et cetera. The reality is that science is still in its infancy. We at Winrock, we're very fortunate. We have been at the forefront of developing some of the techniques and technologies to measure carbon emissions and sequestration, but that science is still at its infancy. It has to get a lot better because a lot of the solutions that are being put forward today to create finance, carbon markets. You may be familiar in the United States with the soil bank concept that has been floating around. A lot of the science around agriculture and resiliency is in the good science is in its infancy, but unfortunately, there's also a lot of bad science, and it would be a tragedy if the bad science and the bad measurement was allowed to become the default for defining resiliency. And then those practices and technologies, those bad practices technologies were promoted and bad finance followed. That's something we're very concerned with at Winrock, because there's such a rush now into this field that anytime you have a gold rush, there are some bad prospectors. And so if I had $1 billion, I would invest that in the development of and improvement of and the promulgation of the best ideas in resiliency technology to assure that the things we do in the next decade or so are scientifically valid, proven, and successful. So.
Thank you. Leesa, for some reason, you got 10 MacArthur Foundation grants in the same year. Surprise. What do you do?
Well, Rodney almost convinced me to change my mind with that last one. But I think that markets move the world. I think markets move agriculture. I think markets put money in the pocket of farmers and help them move out of poverty. And I think they also are the greatest incentive that, that we can provide to smallholder farmers to change behavior. We need more food. The population is growing, and we need more food during a pandemic and in the face of climate change. It's a huge nexus of issues. And what I've seen works well are better markets. One of the problems for agriculture is that markets are so fragmented and such a mess. I think we are starting to see digitally enabled markets in many different formats make sense of very messy markets. I think the digital data trail that emerges from them, and things like I did quite a bit of work with Alibaba and their Taobao, their rural Taobao marketplace, where when they had instant transparency between what someone wanted to buy and what somebody was creating, and there was an instant accountability around that, those triggers and all of that data can inform, they can inform more intelligent markets and more climate smart markets. We've just looked at an interesting project that was done by Siat and Twiga Foods, where they track the data on what people were buying in urban slums. And they found out through the data that, that people weren't buying enough fresh food, and they decided to cut those prices by 10% and increase other prices by 10% and change behavior. And I think that we have the tools, as many people have said, we have the tools to start to make these digital markets work. And I do think that we would need to engage with smallholder farmers around the digital markets to support resilience, to make sure that insurance is there, to make sure that irrigation is there, that climate smart products and services are there. But you convene them in a marketplace, you can work with them, and they're motivated.
Thank you. Last question for everyone. Another last round robin, 1 minute each, because that'll take us to the end of our session. What is one ask or request that you have for someone else on the panel that you have not already made behind closed doors? So we have an accountability game here too. John, I know I put you on the spot twice.
So Samir, I have to ask someone else a question on this panel, or is it going to be general?
Someone on the panel would be good, but I think, because I did start with you last time, we're going to change it up, and we'll give everyone just 30 seconds to think, and whoever wants to go first can just start, and then we'll go from there.
I'll start, just because I really am a huge fan of the potential of the actual work and the potential of WFP. I think that what they're trying to do to buy from farmers almost creates that kind of a marketplace. I just really, my big ask would be to, let's go digital. Let's start looking at a wide range of players that can transform agricultural markets for smallholders.
Great.
Samir, I'll go next.
Great.
My ask would be for all of the folks on the call who represent the private sector. Another, I think, enormously effective activity that's underway now is the net zero solution work that's going on around the world. As most of you know, by now, there are literally tens of thousands of organizations that have proclaimed that they're going to be net zero by fill in the blank 2030, 2040, 2050. We need that too is it has two extraordinary benefits if done properly, and that is think about, as we've alluded to, corporates have a long tail. And if they are determined to create net zero along their entire value chain or supply chain, that is going to have enormous impacts for sustainable agriculture going forward. And the other thing is Winrock, at Winrock, we're doing sort of strategy work for Nestle, for example, and helping them come up with their net zero strategy. We need leaders like Nestle to come forward and say, we're doing this, and this is how we're doing it, so that best practices will take root. Because if you have corporates like Nestle or Mars or Corteva, who we're also working with, who are going to step forward and say, this is the way we're doing it, and that is being done effectively, it's going to have a ripple effect that will soon become a wave, which will become a tsunami. And when you've got corporates pledging to do net zero along their entire supply chain, collectively, when you add that up, it's going to have extraordinary impacts around the world. So,
thank you. And John, I see you're ready. We have 6 people and 3 minutes left.
Real quick.
Let's do 30 seconds.
Yep. So real quick, follow up. One of them is going to be follow up on Rodney's research side, because I think the importance of the connectivity between water use, soil health, carbon sequestration, and greenhouse gas emissions is very strong. And it ties into a question we had on the chat regarding what can consumers do to support smallholder farmers. I think we collectively need to do a better job of telling the story of the smallholder farmer and what consumers do to know where their food comes from. And a lot of times it is a smallholder farmer. So I think collectively I challenge everyone to do a better job of doing that.
Thank you. Lino.
Samir, I go next, and I have to add Bayer to the list of companies that Rodney was mentioning and our sustainability commitments to 2030, also our very leading carbon initiative, so we can reach out offline. But now my request to everybody would be actually to not talk about farmers as abstract entities. So they are our most important private sector partner, and everything can only work if they are working and they have their own business. So please make sure all our solutions or our sustainability solutions have farmers at the center of everything.
Thank you. Sam.
Yeah, great question. Really quickly, I think my key message, my key ask would be advocate, and not necessarily in the traditional way, but advocate for partnerships across sectors, advocate for partnerships across types of entities. I think advocate for transparency in the sector and the work that's being done globally. And I think advocate for support. As you identify entities out there that have the potential to be engaged in meaningful ways, or those that have like-minded philosophies, advocate for support, not just in financial ways, but in other creative ways. And those of us that are out there trying to support this type of incredible work, let us know how else we can help and what we can do to help expand this message.
Thank you. Tania.
Yeah, my ask is probably not to anybody on this panel, because we actually work with everybody on this panel, but it's more, in the broader scheme of things. If you look at the net zero pathway that Rodney talked about, it's very visible that the agricultural sector is pretty much behind everybody else, and for very good reasons, right? Because it's complicated.
Yes.
And so I would love for us to be able to do what the cement sector did, right? There's a decarbonization strategy for cement. There's one for the textile and garment sector. What do we do to create one for rice? What do we do to create one for soy, right? I think that would actually be interesting and would require different parties at the table coming together and publishing their results, so we can keep some of these statements and announcements accountable with facts.
Thank you. And Valerie.
Wow. Well, I think we need, and so I'm addressing this also maybe to the private sector writ large, this importance of helping us to understand the business of small farming and how to make that successful and sustainable. So, how do we take these climate smart solutions and make them a win-win for smallholder farmers and small businesses in the farming sector in the countries that we work? I think we need a lot of help from the private sector to do that. And it would be great to be engaged in a private, public, international, local organization collaboration to make that happen.
We're happy to host field visits whenever anybody wants. Thank you, everyone. To close, my hope is that everyone listening comes away with 3 key messages. One is that solving the smallholder farmer production challenge solves issues in climate, food policy, and the economy. The second is that we need to think about access, but not just access to one thing. We need to think about access in terms of a vertically integrated solution. And third is that partnerships like the Better Farming Alliance, the Better Life Farming Alliance work, and they can scale if we're thoughtful about replication, both from a macro and micro perspective. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to our sponsors, Bayer and Partner for the panel, the IFC. Thank you for the listeners. And I hope you have a wonderful Concordia Summit. Bye, everybody.